The most desperate woman in Cherokee territory froze mid-step, her trembling hands clutching the last of their cornmeal as lightning illuminated something impossible in the mud outside their cabin. Elizabeth Clearwater had seen dying men before, but never one wearing silver spurs worth more than her entire homestead. This wasn't another drifter seeking shelter from the September storm. Morning Star's scream pierced the thunder as she spotted the blood pooling beneath the stranger's expensive boots. Little Fox dropped his whittling knife, the clatter echoing through their one-room home like gunshots. Both children pressed against the doorframe, eyes wide with the recognition that death had come calling on their doorstep. Libby's wedding ring caught the lamplight as she reached for her late husband's rifle, remembering how Joseph had warned her about well-dressed men bringing trouble to honest folk. Her Cherokee grandmother's voice whispered ancient warnings about strangers who appeared during storms, carrying secrets that could destroy families. "Mama, he's still breathing," Morning Star whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Who was this mysterious cowboy, and what had driven him to collapse at the door of the territory's most unfortunate family? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The northeastern Oklahoma Territory stretched endlessly under a punishing September sun, its red earth cracked like broken pottery after 3 months without decent rain. The Arkansas River had shrunk to a muddy trickle, leaving the cottonwoods along its banks withered and desperate. It was 1889, just months after the great land rush had brought thousands of hopeful settlers to stake their claims. But hope was a luxury Elizabeth Clearwater could no longer afford. At 29, Libby possessed the kind of striking beauty that turned heads in church. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, green eyes that spoke of her Scottish father's Highland blood, and the high cheekbones that proclaimed her Cherokee mother's proud lineage. But 14 months of widowhood had carved hollow shadows beneath those eyes, and her once soft hands now bore the calluses of a woman fighting to keep her family alive. Her faded blue dress, patched and repatched with scraps from better times, hung loose on a frame that had grown thin from giving her children the larger portions. The cabin Joseph had built with such hope stood like a monument to broken dreams. 20 acres of what should have been fertile farmland mocked her daily efforts. The corn had withered, the beans had failed, and their 3 remaining chickens produced eggs as sporadically as the territory produced rain. Libby had sold everything of value: Joseph's tools, his horse, even her mother's silver brush set, just to keep the bank from foreclosing. Yet still they circled like vultures, these men in clean suits who spoke of necessary adjustments and unfortunate circumstances. Morning Star, at 10 years old, carried burdens no child should know. Her dark hair, braided with the careful precision Libby had learned from her own grandmother, framed a face too serious for childhood. She could track a rabbit through grassland, identify edible roots, and stretch a pot of soup for 3 days. The Cherokee blood ran strong in her, but so did the practical intelligence of her Scottish grandfather. She moved through their daily struggles with quiet competence, translating between her mother's educated English and the Cherokee phrases that slipped out when emotion overwhelmed careful control. Little Fox, barely 8, remained the heart of their small family despite the persistent cough that had worsened since the drought began. His artistic soul found beauty in everything, arranging pebbles into patterns, carving faces in soap slivers, drawing pictures in the dirt with sticks. Where Morning Star had inherited their father's steady strength, Little Fox possessed their mother's gentle spirit and their Cherokee ancestors' deep connection to the spiritual world. His laughter, when it came, could still fill their humble cabin with something approaching joy. They survived on wild onions, creek water, and the fierce love that bound them together. Each night, Libby read aloud from their battered Bible by lamplight, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her heart. The children would nestle close, and for those precious moments they could almost forget that tomorrow might bring the sheriff with eviction papers, or that their nearest neighbors had already abandoned their claims, or that winter was coming with nothing in their root cellar but hope and determination. The storm had arrived without warning, as September storms often did in the territory, transforming the evening sky from dusty orange to an ominous black-green that made even the chickens huddle nervously in their coop. Libby had just finished dividing their meager supper, wild onion soup stretched with the last of their cornmeal, when the first crack of thunder sent Little Fox scrambling to close the wooden shutters. "Mama, look at the lightning," Morning Star called from the window, her voice filled with the wonder that still occasionally broke through her premature maturity. "It's dancing across the whole sky like spirit fingers." Libby joined her daughter at the window, watching nature's violent display illuminate their struggling homestead in stark flashes of silver and white. The wind had picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across their barren fields like ghostly dancers. Their 3 remaining chickens squawked in protest as rain began pelting the tin roof Joseph had installed during their first hopeful spring. That's when she saw him. A figure stumbled across their yard, appearing and disappearing in the strobing lightning like something from a fever dream. At first glance, Libby thought it might be one of the territory's many drifters seeking shelter, but as lightning illuminated him more clearly, details emerged that made her breath catch in her throat. His clothes spoke of wealth, a fine wool coat that even mud-soaked and torn couldn't disguise its quality, leather boots that would have cost more than Joseph's best horse, and silver spurs that caught the lightning like fallen stars. But it was the blood that made her heart race, dark stains spreading across his shirt front and dripping steadily into the red Oklahoma mud. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, the Irish blessing her father had taught her slipping out before she could catch it. The stranger took 3 more staggering steps before his knees buckled, sending him crashing face first into the muddy yard not 20 feet from their door. The storm swallowed his fall in a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of their small cabin. "Is he dead, Mama?" Little Fox asked, his young voice tight with the fear that had become too familiar since his father's passing. Libby grabbed her shawl and Joseph's old rifle from above the fireplace, her mind racing through possibilities. Well-dressed men didn't just appear dying in their yard without reason. In the territory, money often meant trouble, and trouble had a way of spreading like prairie fire to anyone who got too close. "Morning Star, keep your brother inside," she commanded, checking that the rifle was loaded, "and keep that door barred until I say otherwise." The rain hit her like cold needles as she stepped into the storm, rifle ready but pointed down. Cherokee wisdom passed down from her grandmother taught that all life was sacred, that turning away a soul in need brought bad medicine. But her Scottish father's practical voice whispered warnings about strangers who carried more wealth than sense. Lightning revealed the man's face as she approached. Young, maybe 25, with the strong features and copper skin that marked him as native blood, though his clothes suggested a world far from any reservation. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, and when she rolled him onto his back, her hands came away slick with blood from what looked like bullet wounds. "Mother of mercy," she breathed, then louder, "Morning Star, bring clean rags and boil water, now!" The stranger's eyes fluttered open as she examined his wounds, revealing startling intelligence despite his obvious pain. When he tried to speak, only a whisper emerged, but the words were clear enough to stop her heart. "White Thunder. The papers. They can't find White Thunder." Every native person in 3 territories knew that name, the legendary Lakota chief whose son had vanished years ago during the Indian Wars. If this man was connected to White Thunder's family, helping him could bring the kind of attention that would destroy her own family. But as she looked down at his young face, Seeing her own children's features reflected in his copper skin and dark eyes, Cherokee teachings overwhelmed Scottish caution. Her grandmother's voice echoed across the years. Gitli usti, little one, we do not count the cost of kindness. The spirits watch how we treat strangers, for they may be testing our hearts. Help me get him inside, she called to Morning Star, who had appeared despite orders to stay put. Mind the blood and watch for riders. If someone shot him, they might come looking. Together they dragged the unconscious stranger into their cabin, leaving a trail of mud and blood across the rough wooden floor. As Libby began cutting away his blood-soaked shirt, she discovered something that made her hands tremble. A leather pouch sewn into the lining, heavy with what felt like documents and metal. Whatever secrets this young man carried, she had just made them her family's burden too. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over the Clearwater homestead, finding Libby slumped in Joseph's old rocking chair beside their makeshift sickbed. The stranger, Daniel, he'd whispered during one of his lucid moments, had fought fever through the night like a man wrestling demons. His delirium had revealed fragments of a story that made Libby's blood run cold. Mentions of cattle barons, water rights, and men who killed for profit rather than principle. Morning Star emerged from behind the curtain that divided their sleeping area, her dark eyes immediately finding the patient. His breathing sounds better, Mama. Not so shallow. Praise be, Libby murmured, reaching out to touch the young man's forehead. The fever had broken some time before dawn, leaving him pale but peaceful. Little Fox, still sleeping? Like a baby bear in winter, Morning Star smiled, but her expression quickly grew serious. Mama, those men who might come looking for him, what if they're bad men? Before Libby could answer, the sound of approaching horses froze them both. 3 riders appeared through the morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. Even from a distance, something about their posture suggested trouble. The way they sat their horses too straight, the way their hands rested casually near their weapons. Quick, Libby whispered, helping Morning Star drag Daniel behind the woodpile in the corner. Tell Little Fox to stay quiet, no matter what he hears. The lead rider was a lean man with cold gray eyes and a badge that caught the morning light. His companions looked like hired guns rather than lawmen, hard faces and suspicious stares that catalogued every detail of the humble homestead. Morning, ma'am, the leader called out, touching his hat with mock politeness. Name's Marshal Crawford. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive who might have passed through here last night. Young buck, well-dressed, probably injured. Libby stepped out onto her porch, keeping her hands visible but maintaining the dignified bearing her Cherokee grandmother had taught her. Good morning, Marshal. I'm Elizabeth Clearwater. What sort of crimes is this man accused of? Cattle rustling, assault on a federal officer, and inciting rebellion among the tribes, Crawford replied, his eyes never stopping their examination of her property. Goes by the name Daniel Whitehorse. Might have spun you some tale about being innocent, but he's wanted from here to Colorado territory. The name hit Libby like a physical blow. Whitehorse, son of White Thunder, the famous Lakota chief who had fought alongside Sitting Bull. If Daniel truly was who his fever dreams suggested, he represented either salvation or catastrophe for her struggling family. Haven't seen anyone matching that description, she replied steadily, grateful for the years of teaching school that had trained her to keep her voice level under pressure. As you can see, we don't get many visitors out here. One of Crawford's men, a scarred brute with tobacco-stained teeth, nudged his horse closer to the porch. Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes desperate men hide in barns, root cellars, places like that. I do mind, Libby replied firmly, stepping to block his path. My children are still sleeping, and I don't allow strange men near them. If you have a proper warrant, show it. Otherwise, I'll ask you to respect a widow's privacy. Crawford's eyes narrowed at her defiance, but something in her bearing, the way she held herself like a woman accustomed to respect, made him hesitate. "No warrant needed to pursue a fugitive, ma'am. But we'll be respectful of your situation." As the men dismounted and began searching her property, Libby's heart hammered against her ribs. Behind the woodpile, Daniel remained mercifully unconscious, but she could hear Little Fox's muffled cough from behind the curtain. If Crawford's men discovered their patient, she would have to explain why she'd lied to federal marshals. "Mama?" Little Fox appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His innocent presence seemed to soften even Crawford's suspicious nature. "Go back inside, sweetheart," Libby said gently. "These men are just looking for someone who isn't here." The scarred man emerged from their pathetic barn, shaking his head. "Nothing but 3 scrawny chickens and a broken plow," he reported. "If anyone's hiding here, they'd have to be mighty small." Crawford remounted his horse, but his expression remained unconvinced. "Mrs. Clearwater, if this White Horse character does show up, you'd be wise to send word immediately. He's dangerous, and he's got powerful enemies. People who help him tend to disappear." After the riders disappeared into the morning haze, Libby sagged against her door frame, knees weak with relief. Morning Star emerged from the cabin, her young face tight with worry. "They called him dangerous, Mama. What if we're sheltering a bad man?" Before Libby could respond, a weak voice called from inside the cabin. "Because I'm not what they claim." They found Daniel propped against the wall, his face pale but his eyes alert for the first time since his arrival. The fever had stripped away whatever careful facade he'd maintained, leaving him looking younger and somehow more vulnerable. "The water rights," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "That's what this is really about. Those men work for Augustus Ironwood, not the federal government." Libby knelt beside him, studying his face for signs of deception. "Who are you really? And don't lie to me. I just risked my family's safety for you." Daniel met her gaze steadily, and she saw something in his dark eyes that reminded her of Joseph, a fundamental honesty that couldn't be faked. "My name is Daniel Whitehorse, son of Chief White Thunder of the Lakota. But I'm not a cattle rustler or a rebel. I'm a federal investigator, sent here to uncover illegal water diversions that are destroying farming communities across the territory." The revelation hung in the small cabin like smoke from a green fire, impossible to ignore and difficult to process. Morning Star moved closer to her mother, while Little Fox peeked around the curtain with wide, curious eyes. "Ironwood has been damming streams and selling water rights to railroad companies," Daniel continued. "Small farmers lose their crops. Families like yours lose their homes, and he profits from every acre that goes into foreclosure. I was gathering evidence when his men ambushed me." Libby felt pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. The drought that had destroyed their crops, the mysterious drying of streams that had run clear for generations, the sudden increase in foreclosures throughout the territory. It all pointed to a conspiracy far larger than simple bad luck. "Why should we believe you?" she asked, though something in her heart already did. Daniel reached into his shirt and withdrew the leather pouch she'd discovered the night before. With trembling fingers, he opened it to reveal federal credentials, detailed maps of water sources, and correspondence bearing official government seals. "Because," he said simply, "you and your children are exactly the people I came here to protect." The revelation that Daniel Whitehorse was a federal investigator rather than an outlaw shifted the very foundation of Libby's world. As she studied the official documents spread across her kitchen table, maps marked with water diversions, correspondence with the Department of the Interior, detailed reports of Ironwood's illegal activities, she felt the crushing weight of desperation begin to lift for the first time in 14 months. "These stream measurements," she said, tracing her finger along a hand-drawn map. "This shows our creek should be running at full capacity even during drought season." Daniel nodded, wincing as he shifted position on the makeshift bed they'd arranged near the fireplace. Ironwood's been diverting water 30 miles upstream, selling it to railroad companies for their steam engines and worker camps. Every drop he steals is a drop that doesn't reach families like yours. Morning Star, who had been quietly absorbing every word, suddenly spoke up. Is that why the Hendersons left last month? And the Pratts? They said their wells went dry. Exactly, Daniel confirmed, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and determination. Ironwood's been systematically destroying small homesteads, then buying the foreclosed land for pennies on the dollar. The railroad pays him handsomely for both the water rights and the cleared property. Little Fox emerged from behind the curtain where he'd been sketching, carrying a piece of bark covered with charcoal drawings. I drew the creek like it used to be, he announced, showing them detailed pictures of a stream full of fish and birds, before it got sick. Libby's heart clenched at her son's innocent artwork, but also swelled with pride at his keen observation skills. These drawings are wonderful, sweetheart. You notice things even grown-ups missed. Over the following days, as Daniel's strength slowly returned, their cabin became an unlikely headquarters for uncovering the truth about Ironwood's conspiracy. The federal investigator proved to be more than just an educated man with official papers. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of agriculture, water rights law, and territorial politics that impressed even Libby's well-trained teacher's mind. Your Cherokee ancestors understood water management better than any government bureaucrat, Daniel explained one evening as they studied creek bed patterns by lamplight. They knew that streams are connected like the veins in a body. Cut off one, and the whole system suffers. The compliment to her heritage pleased Libby more than she cared to admit, but it was Daniel's easy interaction with her children that truly captured her attention. He showed Morning Star how to read elevation maps and calculate water flow rates, treating her young mind with the same respect he'd show an adult colleague. With Little Fox, he demonstrated how different artists throughout history had documented environmental changes, encouraging the boy's natural artistic talents while teaching him scientific observation. You know, Little Fox announced one morning while Daniel helped him identify different types of clay for his drawings, I think you should stay with us forever. The innocent declaration hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Daniel's eyes met Libby's across the cabin, and she saw her own complicated feelings reflected there, gratitude deepening into something warmer, more dangerous, more hopeful than either of them had expected. But their growing sense of family was shattered by the arrival of devastating news. Martha Kowalski, their nearest remaining neighbor, rode up to their cabin in tears, her usually neat appearance disheveled and her eyes red with crying. They burned us out, she sobbed into Libby's arms. Last night, while we were sleeping, men with torches and masks, but I recognized that scar-faced one from Crawford's group. They said we had 24 hours to accept Ironwood's offer or face worse consequences. Daniel struggled to his feet despite Libby's protests about his healing wounds. How many families have received ultimatums? Everyone who refused to sell, Martha replied, accepting the cup of precious coffee Libby offered. The Kowalskis, the Johnsons, old Henrik Larson, they're all camping at the church now, afraid to go back to their claims. The systematic intimidation campaign revealed Ironwood's strategy with chilling clarity. He wasn't just stealing water, he was using fear and violence to drive away anyone who might resist his land grab. Small farmers, immigrant families, and anyone without powerful connections found themselves facing an impossible choice: accept his insulting offers or risk everything they'd worked to build. We have to organize the community, Daniel said, his investigator's mind already working on solutions. Ironwood's power depends on people feeling isolated and helpless. If we can unite the remaining families— Unite them how? Libby asked, though she could see the strategic possibilities forming in her own mind. Most folks are too scared to stand up to men with guns and government badges. Not government badges, Daniel corrected, pulling out official correspondence. Crawford's operating under fraudulent authority. Real federal marshals are 3 days' ride away, and they don't even know about his activities in this territory. The revelation that Crawford was essentially a hired gun with fake credentials rather than a legitimate lawman changed everything. It meant Ironwood's operation was more vulnerable than it appeared, but also more desperate. Men operating outside the law had fewer restraints on their methods. Over the next week, their cabin became a gathering place for displaced families. Libby found herself naturally taking on a leadership role, her teaching background helping her organize information and plan strategies. Daniel provided legal expertise and federal connections, while Morning Star and Little Fox served as messengers between scattered homesteads, their small size and natural stealth making them ideal scouts. The children's involvement in adult affairs worried Libby, but she recognized that this fight would determine their future as much as anyone's. If Ironwood succeeded in his land grab, there would be no safe haven for families like theirs anywhere in the territory. "Your children are remarkable," Daniel told her one evening as they watched Morning Star teach other displaced children how to identify edible plants. "They have your strength and intelligence, but also something more, a natural resilience that comes from facing hardship without losing hope." His words, meant as a compliment, instead highlighted the painful reality that her children had been forced to grow up too fast. "They shouldn't have to be this strong," she replied softly. "They should be playing games and learning letters, not planning resistance movements." "But they are learning," Daniel pointed out. "Morning Star is becoming a natural leader, and Little Fox's artistic documentation is providing crucial evidence of environmental damage. They're not just surviving this crisis, they're helping solve it." The growing attraction between Libby and Daniel became impossible to ignore as they worked side by side day after day. Cultural barriers that might have seemed insurmountable under normal circumstances melted away in the face of shared purpose and mutual respect. Daniel's Lakota heritage included a deep reverence for strong women and environmental stewardship that aligned perfectly with Libby's Cherokee values. His education and federal connections offered her family security and opportunity, while her local knowledge and community connections grounded his investigation in human reality. But their budding romance faced obstacles beyond cultural differences. The revelation of Daniel's true identity, not just a federal investigator, but heir to vast cattle holdings and mineral rights his father had secured through strategic treaties, created a wealth gap that made Libby's pride rebel against accepting what might feel like charity. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said one evening when the children were asleep, and they found themselves alone by the dying fire. "The cattle empire, the mineral rights, the federal connections, none of that matters compared to what I've found here." "And what's that?" Libby asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "A family," he replied simply. "A purpose beyond duty or inheritance. The chance to build something meaningful with someone I respect. And love." The word hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Libby's loyalty to Joseph's memory warred with her growing feelings for Daniel, while practical concerns about their different backgrounds and social positions added complexity to what her heart wanted to make simple. Their emotional conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Henrik Larson stood on their porch, his weathered face grim with news that made their personal concerns suddenly seem trivial. "Ironwood's called a territory meeting for tomorrow," the old Norwegian farmer announced. "Says he's got an offer that'll solve everyone's problems. But word is, anyone who doesn't accept will face immediate eviction by federal authority." Daniel's expression hardened with understanding. "He's forcing a final confrontation. Tomorrow, families will have to choose between losing everything they've worked for or standing up to what appears to be overwhelming force." As news of Ironwood's ultimatum spread through their makeshift refugee community, fear and desperation threatened to shatter the fragile unity they'd been building. Some families talked of cutting their losses and accepting whatever terms Ironwood offered, while others spoke of fleeing the territory entirely rather than face his intimidation. "We can't let fear divide us now," Libby addressed the gathered families in her cabin that night. "Separately, we're powerless against Ironwood's money and weapons. But together, with the truth on our side and federal law backing us, we have a chance to save not just our individual homesteads, but the future of honest farming in this territory." Daniel stood beside her, his official credentials providing legal weight to her moral arguments. "The federal government sent me here to stop exactly this kind of corruption, but I can't do it alone. I need your courage, your testimony, your willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous." Morning Star stepped forward from where she'd been listening with the other children. "Mama always taught us that Cherokee people don't run from fights when family is at stake. Well, we're all family now, aren't we?" Her simple statement crystallized something powerful in the room. These displaced families, brought together by crisis and united by shared values, had indeed become something more than neighbors. They'd become a community worth fighting for. The decision to face Ironwood's ultimatum united rather than divided them, but it also raised the stakes tremendously. Tomorrow's confrontation would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of honest settlement in the territory. As families made final preparations and said prayers that might be their last in familiar surroundings, Libby found herself standing at the threshold of changes that would transform her life forever. Whether those changes led to triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but she no longer faced them alone. The territorial meeting convened at high noon in the makeshift town square, where the skeletal frame of what would someday be a proper courthouse cast long shadows across the assembled crowd. Augustus Ironwood had chosen his stage carefully. The unfinished building served as a stark reminder of how much the territory's future remained undecided, subject to the will of those with enough power to shape it. Ironwood himself cut an imposing figure as he stood on the rough wooden platform that served as a speaker's podium. At 58, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his silver hair gleaming in the Oklahoma sun, and his Union cavalry uniform, still worn despite the war's end 24 years prior, displaying enough medals to impress anyone who didn't look too closely at their authenticity. His pale blue eyes swept across the gathered families with the cold calculation of a man evaluating livestock rather than addressing fellow human beings. "Citizens of our great territory," Ironwood began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless military commands and political speeches. "I come before you today not as an adversary, but as a solution to the struggles that have plagued our community." Libby stood near the back of the crowd with Daniel at her side, both of them carefully positioned where they could observe the entire gathering while maintaining escape routes if violence erupted. Morning Star and Little Fox remained at the church with the other children under strict instructions to hide if they heard gunfire. The weight of Daniel's official documents pressed against Libby's ribs where she'd hidden them beneath her best dress, the only evidence that might save their community from Ironwood's elaborate deception. "The drought has been merciless," Ironwood continued, his tone shifting to one of practiced sympathy. "Crops have failed, wells have run dry, and honest families face starvation through no fault of their own. But I have the resources to change that. Water rights, railroad connections, and capital enough to transform this struggling settlement into a prosperous agricultural center." A murmur ran through the crowd as families whispered among themselves, some clearly tempted by promises of prosperity after months of grinding poverty. Ironwood had chosen his timing perfectly, addressing them when hope was scarce and alternatives seemed non-existent. "My proposal is simple," Ironwood announced, producing a stack of legal documents. I will purchase every claim in this district at fair market value, not the depressed prices you might expect, but what your land would be worth under normal circumstances. Furthermore, I will employ every willing family in my agricultural operations, providing steady wages and housing for those who choose to stay. The offer was cunningly crafted to seem generous while masking its true nature. Families desperate enough to consider it wouldn't examine the fine print that would lock them into permanent debt servitude, working land they'd once owned for wages that would never quite cover the rent on company housing. Henrik Larsson, the old Norwegian farmer who'd become an unofficial spokesman for the displaced families, stepped forward from the crowd. And what of those who wish to keep their claims, Mr. Ironwood? What guarantees do we have of water access if you control all the river rights? Ironwood's smile never wavered, but Libby caught the flash of steel beneath his practiced charm. Mr. Larsson, I appreciate your concerns, but practical realities must guide our decisions. The water rights in question have been legally acquired through proper territorial procedures. Those who choose to maintain independent operations will naturally need to negotiate their own arrangements. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the threat. Families who refused Ironwood's buyout would find themselves cut off from water entirely, forced to watch their crops die while his operations flourished. It was extortion disguised as business, backed by fraudulent legal authority and enforced through intimidation. Daniel's hand found Libby's elbow, a subtle signal that he was ready to act. But before either of them could step forward, a voice cut through the crowd from an unexpected direction. Tell them about the dams, Ironwood. Every head turned toward the speaker. A woman Libby didn't recognize, elderly but commanding, wearing travel-worn clothes that suggested a long journey. Her weathered face bore the distinctive features of Plains Indian heritage, and she moved through the crowd with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect. Tell them how you've been stealing water from 30 miles upstream, the woman continued, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. Tell them about the children who've died because their family wells went dry. Tell them about the railroad money that pays for your pretty uniforms and hired guns. Ironwood's composure cracked for the first time, revealing something desperate and dangerous beneath his polished exterior. Ma'am, I don't know who you are or what lies you've been told, but I am Sarah Whitehorse, mother of Chief White Thunder, grandmother of Daniel Whitehorse, the woman declared, and Libby felt her world shift yet again. I am here because my grandson sent word that the truth needed witnesses. Daniel stepped forward then, his federal credentials visible in his hands, his voice carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement. Citizens, I am Special Investigator Daniel Whitehorse, commissioned by the Department of the Interior to investigate illegal water diversions and fraudulent land acquisitions in this territory. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs as Daniel's true identity became clear. Some families who had known him only as the mysterious stranger Libby's family had rescued looked shocked, while others who had begun working with them in recent days nodded with grim satisfaction. The man calling himself Marshall Crawford operates under falsified federal authority, Daniel continued, producing official correspondence. The water rights Augustus Ironwood claims to have purchased legally were obtained through forged documents and bribery of territorial officials who had no authority to grant them. Ironwood's carefully constructed facade began crumbling as Daniel systematically demolished his legal justifications. But rather than retreating, the would-be land baron's expression hardened into something far more dangerous than mere greed. His pale eyes found Daniel across the crowd, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold fury of a man whose deepest secrets had been exposed. "You want the truth?" Ironwood snarled, abandoning all pretense of civilized discourse. "The truth is that you people, red, white, or mixed, are standing in the way of progress. This territory will be developed, with or without your cooperation. The railroad is coming, industry is coming, and the future belongs to those strong enough to seize it. His rant revealed the true scope of his ambitions. This wasn't simply about water rights or land acquisition, it was about the systematic elimination of small-scale agriculture in favor of industrial development that would enrich a few while displacing hundreds of families. "Crawford!" Ironwood shouted, and the false marshal stepped forward with half a dozen armed men who had been positioned strategically throughout the crowd. "These people are in violation of territorial law. Arrest the ringleaders." The moment balanced on a knife's edge as Crawford's hand moved toward his weapon. But before violence could erupt, Sarah Whitehorse stepped directly between the gunman and the crowd, her elderly frame somehow commanding enough presence to freeze armed men in their tracks. "You will not spill blood on sacred ground," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of generations of tribal leadership. "This land remembers every drop of innocent blood that has been shed." Augustus Ironwood. "It remembers the massacre at Willow Creek, where you earned those pretty medals by killing women and children." The accusation hit Ironwood like a physical blow, draining color from his face and revealing the guilty truth that explained his obsessive need to control every aspect of the territory's development. The massacre at Willow Creek had been his secret shame for over 20 years, an atrocity committed against civilians that had been covered up by military bureaucracy and deliberately forgotten by official histories. "That was war," Ironwood whispered, but his protest lacked conviction. It was necessary. It was murder," Sarah Whitehorse replied implacably. "And now you think controlling this land will somehow wash the blood from your hands. But land remembers, Augustus. It remembers everything." The psychological confrontation between the elderly native woman and the guilt-ridden former cavalry officer created a moment of perfect stillness in which the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Crawford's men looked uncertainly between their employer and the dignified grandmother who faced them without flinching, while the assembled families began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple land dispute. Daniel used that moment of hesitation to step forward with his federal authority fully displayed. "By order of the Department of the Interior, I place Augustus Ironwood under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal water rights laws. Any man who interferes with this arrest will answer to legitimate federal marshals." But Ironwood's response shattered the fragile peace like glass. With the desperate fury of a man who saw his life's work crumbling, he drew his sidearm and pointed it directly at Sarah Whitehorse. "Nobody moves," he snarled, his voice cracking with barely controlled hysteria. "Nobody speaks. This ends here, today, my way." The confrontation had exploded into a hostage situation that would determine not just the fate of individual families, but the future of justice in the territory itself. The crack of Ironwood's pistol shattered the afternoon stillness like thunder, but the bullet went wide, striking the wooden platform as Sarah Whitehorse threw herself to the ground with surprising agility for her age. The crowd scattered in panic as Crawford's men drew their weapons, creating a chaos of screaming voices and running bodies that transformed the peaceful gathering into a battlefield. Libby's world narrowed to a single, horrifying focus as she watched little Fox break free from the group of children who were supposed to be safely hidden at the church. Her youngest son ran directly into the line of fire, his small arms outstretched toward Daniel, calling, "Papa! Papa!" with the innocent trust of a child who had already accepted the federal investigator as his father. "No!" Libby's scream tore from her throat as she lunged forward, but Daniel was already moving, his own desperate cry echoing hers as he dove to intercept the boy. The second gunshot came from Crawford's rifle, aimed with deadly precision at the man who threatened their entire operation. Time seemed to slow as Libby watched the bullet find its mark. Daniel's body jerked with the impact, dark blood blooming across his chest as he collapsed just short of reaching Little Fox. The boy stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his young mind unable to process the violence erupting around him. "Danny!" Sarah Whitehorse's anguished cry cut through the gunfire as she crawled toward her fallen grandson, her dignified composure shattered by a grandmother's worst nightmare. "My boy, my precious boy." Henrik Larsson appeared from nowhere, scooping Little Fox into his arms and carrying him to safety behind an overturned wagon while bullets whined overhead. Morning Star emerged from the church despite all instructions to stay hidden, her face white with terror as she watched the man who had become her father figure bleeding into the Oklahoma dust. Libby reached Daniel's side just as his eyes fluttered open, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, and when she pressed her hands against the wound in his chest, warm crimson seeped between her fingers despite her desperate pressure. "The papers," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the continuing gunfire. "In your dress. Get them to real marshals." "Don't talk," Libby commanded, tears streaming down her face as she tried to stem the bleeding with strips torn from her petticoat. "Save your strength. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the light beginning to fade from his dark eyes. The bullet had found something vital, and without a proper doctor within 100 miles, Daniel Whitehorse was dying in her arms while his enemies reloaded their weapons. "Love you," he managed to whisper, his hand finding hers with the last of his strength. "Love the children. Take care of. I love you too," Libby sobbed, pressing her lips to his forehead as his breathing grew more labored. "I love you, Daniel. Please don't leave us. Please." Around them, the battle continued with desperate intensity. Several of the displaced farmers had armed themselves and were returning fire from behind whatever cover they could find, while Crawford's men maintained their positions near the platform. The territorial meeting had become a small war, with families fighting for their homes against hired guns who cared nothing for justice or law. Sarah Whitehorse crawled to her grandson's other side, her weathered hands gentle as she smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Despite the bullets flying overhead, she began to sing in Lakota, her voice strong and clear as she offered the traditional death song that would guide a warrior's spirit to the next world. "He's not dying," Libby insisted fiercely, though she could feel Daniel's pulse growing weaker beneath her fingers. "He can't die. We need him. The children need him." The old woman's eyes met hers across Daniel's still form, and in them Libby saw grief deeper than her own, the sorrow of a grandmother who had already lost too many sons and grandsons to violence. "Child," Sarah said gently, "sometimes love means letting go when the spirit is ready to fly." But Libby refused to accept defeat. Gathering her remaining strength, she pressed harder against the wound, willing her own life force into Daniel's failing body. "Fight," she commanded him. "Fight for Morning Star, who needs a father. Fight for Little Fox, who calls you Papa. Fight for me, because I can't do this alone." For a moment his eyes opened wider, focusing on her face with what seemed like recognition. His lips moved as if he were trying to speak, but no sound emerged except the harsh rattle of air through damaged lungs. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire stopped. Into the silence came a new sound, the thunder of approaching horses, many of them moving fast. Real federal marshals, summoned by telegraph messages Daniel had sent days earlier, arrived in a cloud of dust and official authority, that sent Crawford's men scrambling for their horses. "Drop your weapons," Marshal James Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the weight of legitimate federal law. "By order of the United States government, you are all under arrest." The arrival of real lawmen transformed the situation instantly. Crawford and his surviving men found themselves surrounded by superior numbers and genuine authority, their fraudulent badges worthless against the federal warrants that Harrison and his deputies carried. Ironwood, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him, stood motionless on the platform with his empty pistol hanging from nerveless fingers. But the victory felt hollow as Libby knelt beside Daniel's still form, his blood staining her dress while his grandmother's death song echoed across the battlefield. All the justice in the world couldn't heal the wound that was stealing the man she had come to love from her children's lives. "There's a doctor with our party," Marshal Harrison called out, spotting the crisis. "Army surgeon, rode hard to get here. Let him through." Dr. William Crawford, no relation to the false marshal, pushed through the crowd with his medical bag, his practiced eyes taking in Daniel's condition with professional assessment. His examination was swift but thorough, his hands sure as he probed the wound and checked vital signs. "The bullet missed the heart," he announced after what felt like an eternity. "Collapsed lung, significant blood loss, but if we can get him stable, he has a chance." Hope flared in Libby's chest like a struck match, fragile but bright. "A chance?" "A fighting chance," the doctor confirmed, already preparing instruments from his bag. "But I need clean water, plenty of light, and absolutely no movement while I work." The community rallied around the medical emergency with the same determination they had shown in resisting Ironwood's intimidation. Women brought clean cloth and boiled water, while men constructed a makeshift operating table from church pews. Even former enemies found themselves helping, as the shared crisis reminded everyone of their common humanity. As Dr. Crawford worked to save Daniel's life, the marshals methodically arrested Ironwood and his surviving followers. The evidence Daniel had gathered proved overwhelming: forged documents, falsified water rights, bribery records, and testimony from witnesses across 3 territories. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy their community was finally being dismantled by the very federal authority Ironwood had falsely claimed to represent. But for Libby, kneeling beside the makeshift operating table while her children pressed close against her sides, none of the larger victories mattered compared to the fragile hope that Daniel might survive to see justice done. His breathing remained shallow, his face pale as winter sky, but the skilled hands working over him moved with confident precision. "Is Papa going to be okay?" Little Fox whispered, using the name that had become natural despite knowing Daniel for only a few weeks. "He's fighting," Libby replied, smoothing her son's hair with one hand while keeping the other on Daniel's still arm. "And we're going to fight right alongside him." The surgery continued as shadows lengthened across the territorial square, with an entire community holding its breath for the man who had risked everything to save them all. 3 days after the shooting, Daniel's fever broke just as the first real rainstorm in months began to fall on the Oklahoma Territory. Dr. Crawford had warned that infection posed the greatest danger during recovery, and for 72 hours, the entire community had maintained a vigil around the makeshift medical tent they'd erected beside the church. When Daniel's eyes finally opened clearly, and he managed to speak his first coherent words, asking for Libby and the children, the collective sigh of relief could be heard across the settlement. But even as Daniel's physical condition improved, a deeper truth began to emerge that would shake the foundations of everything Libby thought she understood about their situation. Marshal Harrison, while reviewing the evidence Daniel had gathered, discovered documents that revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had imagined. "Mrs. Clearwater," Marshal Harrison said, approaching her as she sat beside Daniel's bedside, "There's something you need to know about your late husband's death." The words hit her like a physical blow. Joseph's death had been reported as a territorial dispute, a boundary conflict that had escalated to violence. She had accepted that explanation, never questioning the official reports that described him as an unfortunate casualty of frontier lawlessness. "What do you mean?" she asked, though something in the marshal's expression told her she wasn't going to like the answer. Harrison spread out a collection of documents on the small table beside Daniel's bed: correspondence, financial records, and witness statements that painted a picture of calculated murder rather than random violence. "Your husband stumbled onto Ironwood's water diversion scheme 14 months ago. He was gathering evidence, much like Investigator Whitehorse here, when Ironwood's men silenced him. The revelation that Joseph had died not as an innocent victim, but as a hero fighting the same corruption that had nearly killed Daniel, transformed Libby's grief into something sharper and more focused. Her husband hadn't died meaninglessly. He had died trying to protect families just like theirs from the systematic destruction of their livelihoods. "Joseph knew," she whispered, pieces of memory suddenly clicking into place. He'd been asking questions about the creek levels, measuring flow rates, talking to other farmers about their water problems. "According to these documents," Harrison continued gently, "he was planning to contact federal authorities when Ironwood's men ambushed him. They made it look like a boundary dispute to avoid investigation, then used his death as an example to intimidate other potential whistleblowers." Daniel, propped up on pillows and still pale from blood loss, reached for Libby's hand as she processed this earth-shattering information. "Your husband was a brave man," he said quietly. "He died trying to do what I came here to finish." The irony was almost too much to bear. She had fallen in love with the man who was completing her dead husband's mission, unaware that their fates had been intertwined long before that stormy night when she'd found Daniel bleeding in her yard. Joseph's investigation had paved the way for Daniel's arrival, and Daniel's survival would ensure that Joseph's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. But the revelations didn't end there. As Marshal Harrison continued reviewing seized documents, he uncovered evidence that Ironwood's corruption reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Officials who should have been protecting settlers' rights had instead been taking bribes to falsify water rights and ignore fraudulent land claims. "The scope of this conspiracy is staggering," Harrison admitted. "Ironwood wasn't just stealing from individual families. He was systematically undermining the entire territorial settlement process. Without intervention, every honest farmer in 3 counties would have been driven off their land within 2 years. Even more shocking was the discovery that Ironwood's operation was part of a larger network of corruption spanning multiple territories. Railroad companies, land speculators, and corrupt officials had been working together to concentrate vast holdings in the hands of a few wealthy investors, using violence and fraud to eliminate any resistance. "This case is going to make headlines from here to Washington," Harrison continued. "The federal government is preparing major reforms to prevent this kind of systematic fraud." Investigator Whitehorse's work and your husband's preliminary investigation will be cited as examples of why these changes are necessary. While Libby struggled to process the magnitude of what her family had unknowingly been caught up in, another shock awaited her. Sarah Whitehorse, who had remained at Daniel's bedside throughout his recovery, finally revealed the full truth about her grandson's background and the enormous responsibility he carried. "Child," the old woman said, pulling Libby aside for a private conversation, "there are things about my grandson that even he doesn't fully understand yet." Sarah explained that Daniel's inheritance wasn't just cattle and mineral rights. It included treaty obligations and tribal responsibilities that made him one of the most influential Native American leaders in the entire region. His father, Chief White Thunder, had negotiated agreements that protected not just Lakota interests, but the rights of all indigenous peoples in the territory. "When Daniel recovers," Sarah continued, he will face a choice. He can return to his federal duties and his tribal responsibilities, or he can choose a different path. But you should know that either choice will bring pressures and dangers that most families never face. The implications were staggering. Loving Daniel meant accepting not just his wealth and status, but also the constant threat from those who wanted to exploit or eliminate Native American influence in the territory. Their family would always be targets, always under scrutiny, always balancing personal happiness against larger political responsibilities. As if these revelations weren't overwhelming enough, Dr. Crawford delivered news that forced Libby to confront another life-changing reality. During his examination to monitor Daniel's recovery, the doctor had noticed symptoms that led him to examine Libby as well. "Mrs. Clearwater," he said gently, "I believe you may be expecting a child." The possibility hadn't even occurred to her amid all the crisis and chaos, but as she considered the signs she'd been too distracted to notice, the truth became undeniable. She was carrying Daniel's child, conceived during those precious few weeks when they'd worked together to organize the community, when their relationship had deepened from gratitude to love. The pregnancy meant that regardless of whatever choices lay ahead, their lives were now permanently intertwined. This child would be born into a complicated legacy, Cherokee, Lakota, and Scottish heritage with ties to both federal authority and tribal sovereignty, wealth and responsibility that most people could barely imagine. When she shared the news with Daniel, his response revealed the depth of his transformation from solitary investigator to family man. Despite his own pain and weakness, his face lit up with joy that overshadowed every other concern. "A child," he repeated wonderingly, his hand moving instinctively to cover hers. "Our child." Morning Star and Little Fox, who had been hovering nearby throughout his recovery, reacted to the news with the enthusiasm of children who had already accepted Daniel as their father. The prospect of a baby brother or sister seemed to cement their sense of family completeness, regardless of the complex circumstances surrounding their unusual courtship. But even as they celebrated this personal joy, the wider implications of their situation continued to unfold. Marshal Harrison informed them that Ironwood's trial would likely require testimony from everyone involved, including the children. The case had attracted attention from newspapers and politicians who saw it as a symbol of either frontier justice or federal overreach, depending on their political views. "Your family has become the face of this entire corruption scandal," Harrison warned. "That brings both protection and danger. There will be people who see you as heroes and others who see you as threats to their own interests." The weight of public attention, combined with the revelation of Joseph's true fate and the prospect of raising a child under such circumstances, threatened to overwhelm Libby's ability to process it all. Everything she thought she knew about her life had been revealed as incomplete or false, while the future stretched ahead filled with possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. As rain continued to fall outside their makeshift medical tent, washing away months of drought and beginning the process of healing the damaged land, Libby realized that her family stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their personal fate, but their role in the larger story of justice and corruption in the American frontier. The choices they made in the coming days would echo through generations, affecting not just their own children but the future of settlement and native rights throughout the territory. 6 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across the transformed landscape of what was now officially known as Clearwater Valley, named in honor of both Joseph's sacrifice and the community's successful fight for water rights. The spring rains had returned the land to verdant life, with green fields stretching to the horizon and the creek running clear and full for the first time in years. Where drought and despair had once ruled, hope and prosperity now flourished under the careful stewardship of families who had learned that unity was stronger than any individual hardship. Libby stood on the porch of their new home, a spacious log structure that Daniel had insisted on building large enough to accommodate not just their growing family, but also the stream of visitors who came seeking advice on farming, water management, and territorial law. Her pregnancy had progressed beautifully, and Dr. Crawford, who had decided to establish a permanent practice in the valley, predicted the baby would arrive within the month. "Mama, look what little Fox painted," Morningstar called out, carrying her brother's latest artwork with the careful reverence it deserved. The boy's artistic talents had blossomed under the encouragement of several visiting journalists who documented the valley's transformation, and his paintings now served as both historical record and inspiration for other young artists throughout the territory. The painting depicted their family as they stood now. Daniel, fully recovered and more handsome than ever in his role as both federal liaison and community leader. Libby, radiant with pregnancy and the satisfaction of work well done. Morning Star, poised on the edge of young womanhood and already showing signs of the natural leadership that would serve her well in years to come. And little Fox himself, healthy and happy, his artistic vision capturing the love that bound them all together. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Libby said, examining the careful detail with which her youngest son had rendered each face. "You've captured something true about us." Daniel emerged from the house carrying official correspondence from Washington, his expression mixing pride with the weight of ongoing responsibility. Ironwood's trial had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through corrupt networks across multiple territories, but the reforms needed to prevent similar conspiracies required constant vigilance and political effort. "The Interior Department wants to establish a permanent oversight office here in the valley," he announced, settling beside Libby on the bench swing he'd built during his recovery. "They're offering me the position of regional coordinator for Native and settler relations." The offer represented everything they had worked toward: legitimate authority to protect honest families from exploitation, resources to ensure sustainable development, and recognition that cooperation between different communities produced better results than competition or conflict. It would also mean remaining in the valley permanently, putting down roots that could weather any future storms. "What do you think?" Libby asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. Daniel had found his calling in this work that honored both his federal training and his tribal heritage, creating bridges between worlds that had too often been set against each other. "I think," he replied, his hand covering hers where it rested on her rounded belly, "that our children deserve to grow up in a place where justice isn't just a dream, but a daily practice." Their children, plural now, with the baby coming soon, and the two they had already claimed as completely their own. Morning Star had legally taken the White Horse name while keeping Clearwater as her middle name, honoring both her birth father's sacrifice and her chosen father's love. Little Fox had made the same choice, though he'd announced his intention to sign his artwork as Fox Clearwater Whitehorse because artists need names that sound important. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their peaceful moment. But these days, visitors brought welcome news rather than threats. Sarah Whitehorse rode up to their house accompanied by Henrik Larson and several other valley families, all of them dressed in their finest clothes for the special occasion they had planned. "Grandson!" Sarah called out with the authority that had made her a respected leader among multiple tribes. "It is time." The Cherokee naming ceremony for their unborn child had been planned for weeks, a celebration that would welcome the baby into not just their immediate family, but the larger community that had become their extended clan. Traditional foods prepared by women from 6 different cultural backgrounds filled tables arranged in their yard, while children from throughout the valley gathered to witness the blessing. Dr. Crawford arrived with his medical bag just in case Libby's labor began during the excitement, but also carrying a small gift wrapped in soft deerskin. "For the newest member of our community," he explained, his own transformation from army surgeon to family doctor reflecting the healing that had touched everyone in the valley. As the ceremony began with prayers in Cherokee, Lakota, Norwegian, and English, Libby reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a desperate widow facing foreclosure and starvation. Now she was surrounded by love, security, and a community that had learned to see strength in diversity rather than threat. "The spirits have blessed this child," Sarah Whitehorse announced, her hands warm as they rested on Libby's belly. "With parents who know both struggle and joy, with siblings who understand the value of family chosen by love, and with a community that will nurture strength, wisdom, and compassion." The baby kicked vigorously in response to his grandmother's words, as if already eager to join the celebration. Daniel's arm tightened around Libby's shoulders as they felt their child's movement, a promise of life continuing and growing stronger with each generation. As evening approached and the last of their guests departed with full hearts and fuller stomachs, the Whitehorse family settled into the comfortable rhythm of their daily life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight they were simply a family, complete and content in the knowledge that love, justice, and community had triumphed over greed, corruption, and hatred. Their story had become legend throughout the territory. The unfortunate woman who saved a cowboy and discovered that kindness, courage, and truth could transform the world. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments. When Elizabeth Clearwater found that wounded stranger bleeding in her yard, she had no idea that her simple act of kindness would transform not just his life, but her entire world. Like so many of us who've faced loss, financial hardship, and uncertainty about the future, Elizabeth discovered that opening our hearts when we have the least to give often leads to receiving more than we ever imagined possible. Her story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that love can bloom again even after devastating loss, and that the families we choose can be just as precious as those we're born into. In a world that often feels divided and harsh, Elizabeth and Daniel's journey shows us that courage, compassion, and community still have the power to overcome corruption and despair. Their children learned that strength comes not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it together with people who truly care. As we navigate our own later chapters, their story whispers a beautiful truth. The best is yet to come when we dare to believe in love's ability to heal, restore, and create new beginnings at any age. Questions for reflection. What act of unexpected kindness changed your life's direction? How has opening your heart during difficult times led to unexpected blessings in your own journey? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs hope today.